Welcome everyone to another installment of Philosopher Meets Critics, an event organized by the Federal University of Bahia and Concept, the Cologne Center for Contemporary Epistemology and the Kantian Tradition. Today we are happy to have Maya Goldenberg presenting her book about vaccine hesitancy. Maya is a professor from the University of Guelph, and she has a new book entitled Vaccine Hesitance, Public Trust, Expertise, and the War on Science. The book will be published this year by University of Pittsburgh Press, and you can find more information about Maya's book at the description below. So, welcome Maya, and joining us today, we also have two critics discussing Maya's book. So welcome to Sven Bernecker from University of Cologne, and also Director of Concept. And welcome Kristen Intemann from Montana State University. It's great to have you all here. And once again, I would like to thank all the participants for accepting the invitation to join this session. We will start first with a short presentation by Maya, and after that, we will allow our two critics to give their comments. So without further ado, I would like to invite Maya to start the session telling us about the main idea of the book, Vaccine Hesitance. Please, Maya.
Thank you so much. I want to thank everyone at the Federal University of Bahia, also to the Concept Group at the University of Cologne for organizing this book symposium and for inviting me, especially Felipe, Sybil, and Waldemaro. I really do appreciate this opportunity to share my work. And I also want to give special thanks to the commentators today. It really is a privilege to have smart people give sustained attention to your work and then even have a discussion about it. So thank you for being here. Okay, so I'll speak a little about the book. In it, I challenged conventional thinking about vaccine hesitancy. First, I challenged the idea that vaccine hesitancy stems from members of the public's problematic relationship with science, that people don't understand science or they don't appreciate it, or they deny science. I reject that very common view. The second common view that I reject is that vaccine hesitancy is a problem of affluence. The profile of vaccine hesitators in industrialized countries has been and still is rich white people, and I reject that too. My research focus was on parents in industrialized nations who hesitate on pediatric vaccines. This cohort gets a lot of attention because they seem so odd. In these countries, vaccines are, for the most part, easy to access. Health systems are relatively stable, for the most part, again. And there is so much vaccine information and communications directed at the publics. So people ask, you know, what's going on here? So when I started this research, so this was about 6 years ago, when in what I thought would be a one-time conference presentation and maybe a paper, I had already unwittingly accepted these supposed truths about vaccine hesitators. First, that vaccine hesitators are missing some kind of key information and some understanding of science. That's surely what causes vaccine hesitancy. And the second, that vaccine hesitancy was a problem of affluence. So I didn't set out to deny these claims. I assumed they were true. That's what the research seemed to show. And this shaped my initial thinking. So I started this project with those assumptions in mind. I started the project wondering what evidence was going to convince these people. And that really is how most people approach the problem of vaccine hesitancy. And of course, as an epistemologist focused on healthcare, I thought I was in a good position to find out. There wasn't any philosophical writing available on this specific question, but I looked into science communications literature. I read vaccine hesitant parents' narratives, both personal accounts and qualitative research on vaccine hesitant parents. And this made me realize that I was asking the wrong question. It wasn't scientific misunderstanding and misinformation that was driving vaccine hesitancy. Even active disinformation, what I mean intentional false claims, isn't the root cause. So I ended up reframing vaccine hesitancy as a crisis of public mistrust that signals a need for institutional structures that are responsive to issues of justice and equity. So all my suggestions later in the book were about how to restore confidence in vaccines have to do with creating those conditions. As for this reframing as a crisis of public trust, here philosophy of science and science studies was very instructive. There's lots of philosophical work on trust, especially epistemic trust, and that really did guide me in my thinking through the problems. I finished final edits on the manuscript in May 2020, not long after COVID had reached pandemic status. And I've been able to watch how things have progressed over almost a year of pandemic life. And I think the points of focus in the book about public trust and also my rereading of the problem of expertise, as well as matters of inequities and injustice, are germane to understanding COVID response too, including, of course, COVID vaccine acceptance and hesitancy. So just a definition of vaccine hesitancy, it is a feeling of ambivalence about vaccines. And that attitude can predict behavior, namely vaccine refusal, but it doesn't guarantee it. Some vaccine hesitators will follow the recommended vaccine schedule, others will refuse it, and there's also a good group that tries to negotiate some kind of augmented schedule, what they see as some sort of reasonable middle ground where they skip some vaccines but take others, or start their child's vaccination a little bit later in life, or space out the vaccines over a longer period of time. Public health scholars agree that we need to keep an eye on the attitude, not just the behavior, in order to protect public health. So the past 7 or 8 years, I'd say, yeah, the past 7 or 8 years, vaccine hesitancy has been a major area of public health research. And my book comes in as the first philosophy monograph on that subject. And I come in with an understanding of vaccine hesitancy to be a localized phenomenon that is responsive to the historical and the present situations of people in relation to scientific institutions, public health infrastructure, and political forces. So in short, vaccine confidence and hesitancies are indicators of how much people trust the system. There is some empirical support for this contextual view. I'll offer this one. There are huge global surveys of vaccine attitudes and intention to vaccinate. So often hundreds of countries, some of these surveys will do over 100 countries and do thousands and thousands of people. And you find wide differences in vaccine confidence and vaccine hesitancy from country to country. Yet, despite these kinds of indications that context matters, the view that vaccine hesitancy is a science problem still persists. It stubbornly persists, I'd say. I end up spending half of my book arguing against that view. I call that view the war on science, to denote this common perception that science is undermined or under attack and needs to be defended in order to resolve vaccine hesitancy. The second half of the book then builds up the alternative thesis that vaccine hesitancy signals a problem of trust. This framework centralizes the social and political context in which healthcare decision-making occurs. Now, thinking about vaccines historically, sometimes people ask me this question, like, why vaccines and not other health interventions? But historically, and that is a good question. Historically, vaccines have always been a social and political flashpoint. I notice that they capture the local anxieties of the moment and the place. Just to give an example, when the English physician Edward Jenner invented the first vaccine, this was in 1796, placing cowpox pus under the epidermis to create an immune response against smallpox. The critics at the time fretted that the practice was sinful in its mixing of human and animal species. You can see political satire at that time alluding to the biblical story of the worship of the golden calf. So that's what the concern was. If I move you forward to the progressive social movements of the 1970s, vaccine hesitancy took a different form. There was at that time a growth of patients' rights movements, women's liberations movements, and in those contexts, vaccination received criticism for the perception that vaccines signaled medical paternalism, that's the doctor knows best attitude, as well as patriarchal governance over women's and children's bodies. These were the very conventions that civil rights activists were rejecting, and they saw that in vaccines. And it's especially the women's rights issue still continues in vaccine hesitancy today. There's also a heightened environmental awareness that was happening at the time, activism in response to industrial pollutants, and this led to scrutiny regarding the ingredients in vaccines and their potential toxicity. So I'm tracing here, in admittedly just a few examples, I'm tracing here how vaccine hesitancy reflects the cultural anxieties of the moment and the place. And all the while, vaccine hesitancy is still characterized as stemming from scientific misunderstanding and misinformation. And as if that's not enough, there's more to vaccines than just the way they've been picked up historically. Vaccines are politically charged because they're often tied to government mandates and requirements. So there's plenty of vaccine hesitators and refusers will say that they would be satisfied to leave vaccines to individual choice of the patient or the parent. But of course, most vaccines don't work that way. We need wide community coverage to enact its protective effect, which is why we bring in legal mechanisms to ensure that kind of coverage. So if we can agree that vaccine controversy is about much more than vaccines, and that's what I spend a long time arguing in my work, that they represent and reflect localized concerns, you might ask, what do vaccines signify at this moment in industrialized nations with democratic political regimes? Those localized anxieties might include how technology shapes our lives, who decides and who regulates those technological intrusions, the relationship of knowledge and power. For example, whose interests do science serve? Is it science for the people or science for corporate interests? Vaccine controversy also stems from concerns about government overreach when there are legal requirements. Those requirements are potentially threatening to individual liberty and family autonomy. Lastly, vaccines also elicit thoughts and considerations about globalization, multiculturalism, community cohesion, health disparities, income inequality. All that gets packed into our feelings and beliefs about vaccines. And those concerns that I just outlined, those are concerns about justice and values. High levels of scientific literacy will actually not help individuals work through these problems, nor will very high level vaccine science literacy provide much political direction on what the most publicly acceptable policies will look like. Yet the charge of scientific illiteracy still dominates. And I will admit that the public debates over vaccines, those highly charged shouting matches, often look like problems of scientific misunderstanding. For example, when vaccine hesitators and refusers will challenge scientific claims, apparently with no grounds for doing so, they make inaccurate statements like vaccines aren't safe, they're not effective, vaccines aren't necessary. So people point to that and they say, aha, that's scientific illiteracy. And that thesis does seem to fit. But there is evidence coming from science communications research into public resistance to scientific claims. So other ones, including climate change and GMOs. And this research shows that public disagreements on the status of science are often surface level debates, where science serves as a placeholder for the underlying values that are under threat. And this would explain why publicly controversial scientific issues divide along political partisan lines and not according to levels of education or scientific literacy. And let's not forget that we live in political times or political worlds where scientism prevails. Political leaders promise to follow the science for policies that impact our lives profoundly. And as a result, those value conflicts do not get proper airing. So no wonder we fight about science. So I see that it looks like a science illiteracy problem at times. But highly educated people are not the most vaccine confident. In fact, all the research shows that highly educated people display the most polarized views on vaccines. They are the strongest vaccine proponents, as well as the most hardened vaccine skeptics. So education and access to information does not, it seems, push everyone in favor of vaccination. By my reading of many social studies, social science interviews and surveys of vaccine hesitant parents, and I should add, there are so many of them. I don't know why the media still chooses to black box vaccine hesitators as somehow puzzling and unclear. There's a lot of research out there. By what I could see from the research is that parents understand the consensus on vaccines perfectly. What they do is question the integrity of those consensus claims. They don't trust the source. So parents will say, across the board in many countries, in every interview I've read, they will say they are not comfortable with industry-funded biomedical research. They worry that some vaccines may not be entirely safe. They might even admit that most vaccines might be safe, but their kid might be the rare victim of a serious adverse event. So where is the scientific misunderstanding there? It's also wrong to assume that parents' confidence or hesitancy is a purely cognitive or intellectual decision, that where you read the science and then you draw a conclusion. Instead, there's much more than scientific information that goes into healthcare decisions. There's affective commitments, there's reestablishing of social connection to other people and the groups that shape our identity and our understanding of things. What do your friends think? What about your religious leaders? What is your relationship or your community's relationship to the healthcare system, the school system, your employer, and any other influences on vaccination? And of course, we know that knowledge acquisition is social. Who you trust for information, it turns out, largely determines what you know about vaccine safety and about everything else. So taking on that, I would say that parents who vaccinate their children or themselves do it confidently if they trust the systems of expertise. That includes the governing institutions tasked with effectively managing public health threats while respecting democratic values. Some parents also value herd immunity, but the sociology literature suggests that parents are primarily motivated by individual responsibility for their own children. Now, parents who don't vaccinate are ambivalent about vaccines because they do not share that trust. It's lowered public confidence that is the problem, and it's not created by poor scientific literacy or misinformation on the internet or persuasive celebrity endorsements. Those are confounders for sure. They influence understanding and behavior when social trust in the institutional apparatuses available for managing risk is low. So there is some evidence to support this coming from studies of the H1N1 pandemic of 2009. There was a study of public uptake of the H1N1 vaccine in the United States that found that people who trusted the government's ability to deal with an epidemic were 3 times more likely to take the vaccine than those who did not. There were similar findings from a study in France, also concerning the H1N1 vaccine. I'm wondering, of course, whether COVID vaccine hesitancy is going to follow that same course. It seems the case that you need to trust the government in order to trust the vaccine. I think that there's truth to that. But then again, we might find that there is a presence of politically disillusioned people who think the COVID vaccine is our last chance when they look at their government's spectacular failures to contain the virus and minimize harm through non-pharmaceutical interventions. I don't know how this will go as we stumble along with our COVID vaccine rollouts and with not much of a wider global plan. So I'll be watching this with a lot of interest. So I'd said that reading vaccine parents' testimonials, what I saw was not the presence of science illiteracy. I really could see that parents didn't trust the systems of health and governments because they said that much. They said, as I mentioned, they are uncomfortable with the current workings of industry-funded health research. They just think that there's too much influence on biomedical research, healthcare education, and health practice. I also want to bring attention to what wasn't being said in those studies. I'd mentioned that vaccine hesitancy is characterized as a problem of affluence or a malaise of the rich. And as I worked up my thesis that mistrust is the problem, not scientific illiteracy, this empirically verified fact that rich people and affluent people are more vaccine hesitant struck me as odd. It was the opposite of what you might expect given the large body of research into trust in healthcare. In this body of research in trust in healthcare, racialized, disenfranchised, and otherwise marginalized people and groups tend to be the most reluctant to participate in healthcare. And these attitudes are grounded in historic and contemporary health injustices. Once I looked into that, trying to explain that odd thing, I found what can go wrong when you approach empirical research without a good theoretical grounding. The studies measuring vaccine hesitancy used sampling methods and measurement tools that biased the respondent pool. Researchers were not actively recruiting racialized people. And so the vaccine hesitancy research was reflecting the attitudes of the people most likely to fill out surveys and agree to interview requests. There's been very little research that's been done on racialized people and populations. I think I found 5 American studies. And in that little available body of literature, you do find greater levels of vaccine hesitancy among racialized communities, significantly greater. So this characterization of vaccine hesitancy as a problem of affluence doesn't seem to hold. It definitely needs more research. And we might think about how outreach needs to be adjusted in light of that. So these 2 key sources of vaccine hesitancy, I named them the 2 key sources: unease about conflicts of interest, financial conflicts of interest, and response to historic and contemporary racism in healthcare and public health. These are known problems that we also know have been neglected by those institutions that people need to trust in order to be confident about vaccines. Conflict of interest regulation is minimal despite heavy public dissatisfaction. This is well polled and well known. That's presumably conflicts of interest are not well managed. Like, we don't create a separation between industry and research because the people who are in power, that have the power to enact this kind of change, they benefit from those close relationships between industry, government, and health research. Meanwhile, looking at medical racism and public health injustices, the kind of considerations that are needed to respond to past harms of medical racism, to restore any semblance of justice, we have barely scratched the surface. I mean, we're still fighting about removing statues of racist doctors. The resources that are needed to deal with the harms still occurring today are not being put in place, or they're being minimally put in place, I'd say. So I argue that the evidence, I'll wrap this up, that the evidence most of the publics accept on vaccines really turns crucially on epistemic trust. And it's poor trust in the expert sources that engender vaccine hesitancy. So even consensus claims, even strong consensus claims with reference to many, many studies won't convince people if the source is not perceived as trustworthy. So as I try to think through what do we need to do to address vaccine hesitancy, I want to know, what if we focused on building that trust rather than the current practices, which are trying to educate the misinformed public, or sometimes just puzzling over their moral and epistemic failings with no clear end in sight. Doing that would not discount that public health agencies may have very convincing science to support their directives. What it does mean is we recognize that having the best science is not enough. The expert or the testifier and the institutions they represent need to be trustworthy, but they also need to be perceived as trustworthy by public health stakeholders. Our institutions are wavering on credibility. That's why we are here talking about vaccine hesitancy. And until those sources of public mistrust are adequately addressed, the credibility of any health governance institution or institutional framework will struggle with this problem of vaccine hesitancy. Okay, that's all I wanted to say. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Maya. Great presentation. So we're going to start first with Kristen. Kristen, please.
I do have a PowerPoint, so I'm just gonna, hopefully that's good. So I thank you so much. Thanks to the organizers of this, and thanks to Maya Goldenberg for such a fantastic book. I'm put in a challenging position of being a critic of a view that I largely agree with, but I'm going to hopefully have some points to make for a discussion. So Maya Goldenberg's book does an excellent job, I think, of showing how the dominant narrative about vaccine hesitancy as part of what she just referred to as a war on science is not only wrong, but really potentially dangerous for both science, and also even our own political practices. Vaccine hesitancy, she convincingly shows, cannot be understood merely in terms of public misunderstanding of science, cognitive biases, or the so-called death of scientific expertise, right, or rejection of experts. And as she notes in chapter 4, rather than being a war on science, the public controversy that frames vaccine hesitancy and other highly charged science policy controversies is a proxy for value conflicts and differing visions of democracy, end quote. So Goldenberg's work, I think both in this book and in other articles that she's written, offers a really fruitful alternative for thinking about vaccine hesitancy as a crisis of trust rather than a crisis of understanding. The book is not only insightful, but timely. Although she mentioned it was largely written before the COVID-19 pandemic, I believe the pandemic has shown in many ways the importance, both the importance and the fruitfulness of this framework. And so not just for vaccine hesitancy and refusal, but I think it potentially offers us a way to understand resistance that we've seen a lot in the United States, I can tell you, but I can see that it's also happening in other countries across Europe, but resistance to public health recommendations. So I'm going to try to do two things in my 10 minutes. I'm going to try to just show how her analysis might be applied potentially more broadly to help us understand the current moment with resistance. I'm going to focus on the example of masking, just because it's a simple one. And then I think through this example, I'm going to try to highlight two lingering sets of questions that at least are in my mind after reading the book, to invite her to say a little bit more about the nature of trust and also the ways in which trust and values and public understanding and cognitive biases and social media and many of the things she talks about might interact. So I'm going to start. Oops, those were my two aims. I forgot to do the bullet points as I was talking, but those are the two things. So, okay. So I want to just think really briefly about masking and resistance that we're seeing, especially in certain parts of the United States of masking, against masking and other public health recommendations. And so recall that on the so-called standard war on science view of resistance, right? It's due to public confusion or lack of understanding, certain cognitive biases, right? People don't want to believe things that go against the other things they want to believe, and the rejection of expertise, right? Thinking, I'm not listening to the scientists. So, it's interesting, some colleagues of mine have been, and I've been a part of this interdisciplinary research group, looking at beliefs and attitudes about masking in Montana, and particularly in rural communities. We've also done some survey work in Native American indigenous communities, but for a variety of complicated reasons, I'm gonna talk less about that group. They're sort of a distinct group with a distinct set of concerns and things going on. Masking is much more prevalent on our reservations than in some of our rural, predominantly white communities. I thought I'd share this about Montana, even though some of you may not even know where the heck Montana is in the world, but it is one of a few states in the United States that has a particularly low percentage of people that follow public health recommendations like masking. So what is it that people say when they're asked? Well, so interestingly, those who reject masks often correctly, right, point to mixed messages about the efficacy of masking. They show that there's often been mixed messages even by some of those who are highly recognized as scientific experts. We were told early on in the pandemic, oh no, don't get a mask. Like, instead of being pretty honest, like, well, they might help, but we need them for healthcare professionals, right? There was all these concerns raised about efficacy, even by the science. And interestingly, they come armed like to public health board meetings with a stack of scientific studies that are, and oftentimes genuine scientific studies, showing that cloth masks are less effective. Some of these are pre-pandemic studies on showing that cloth masks are no good, but nonetheless, they point to these. So it's not as if they're ignorant of science. They may sometimes fail to note some of the epistemically relevant features that make some of those studies limited. Although those who purport to we need to follow the science often aren't able to articulate why some scientific studies are better either. So, but and this I think comes back to a lot of what Goldenberg talks about with vaccines. They often agree that yes, masking is effective, but it should be a matter of personal choice and not something mandated by governments, as well as a lot of the other restrictions that we look at. And so I really kind of want to focus on some things that Goldenberg says in chapter 4 of her book, and particularly this notion of scientized politics that she discusses. And so public health officials really see the question of whether masks should be mandated as turning just on this empirical question of are they effective against transmission of the virus, right? But clearly there's value judgments that we need to get us from there to the claim that they should be mandated. And so, oftentimes these are values that many of us share, that we think are kind of no-brainers, that the burden of mask wearing is small, that the benefits of widespread masking are enormous. They protect the vulnerable. They lessen the burden on our healthcare system. A small restriction on individual liberty seems warranted if it's going to greatly contribute to the public good, right? But what's interesting is it seems quite clear that these are not universally held values, right? So in fact, those who, and some of the pictures that are coming are from, this one isn't from Montana, but the next one is. But they claim that the burden of masking and other policies, in particular, things like lockdowns and whatnot, are actually quite significant, right? That they're not insignificant. And they think masking is potentially much more of a burden than we might assume. And particularly in the context that they view their own individual risk as small in many cases, right? So they think, look, I'm probably not going to die from this, so why should I have to restrict my liberty or have trouble talking or be uncomfortable or not have facial expressions? And they are not convinced that liberty should be restricted in order to benefit others. And they also, this, I think it's helpful, particularly for people on the more liberal progressive side, to think about the arguments that are often given in relation to abortion. So we think often, okay, no, we don't want to agree to even small restrictions because it's going to kind of snowball into greater restrictions and on reproductive freedom, for example. But interestingly, on the same, other end of the political spectrum, right, they see that even if the restriction on individual liberty seems small, it's really not, because it's part of a broader tendency, a dangerous precedent for giving the government greater control and over our lives. And so, that's part of where that resistance comes from. This is from a protest that happened at our state capitol. So really quick lessons. I agree with Goldenberg that resistance to public health recommendations is just deeply embedded in value disagreements. And it's really also fueled by distrust both of government and then also sometimes public health officials and in some cases scientists. In addition to conflicts of interest, there's the worry that scientists themselves may in some cases have a kind of political agenda, right? So hitting people over the head with the science is not only unlikely to be effective, but it might even exacerbate distrust, right? And so I also think that this case illustrates another point that Goldenberg made about how communicating in ways that speak to diverse values can be crucial. I was really struck by the example of Australia's I Immunize campaign to show how, I believe in homeopathy and I immunize, I eat natural foods and I immunize. And I think that, for some of these groups, being able to say, linking mask wearing to values that they care about, linking them to freedom, linking them to keeping our economy open might actually be more effective, showing how those things are compatible. So now I just want to raise two sets of questions. I realize this is going very quickly, but two sets of questions. So I want to just invite Maya to say a little bit more. I think while the traditional war on science narrative may not fully capture the ways that, you know, an explanation for why vaccine hesitancy occurs, I did think that, you know, there's complicated ways in which these things interact. So there are kind of these cases of active creation and dissemination of disinformation, so-called, you know, manufacturing doubt, whether it's about vaccines or climate change or election results or whatever it might be, right? That really are geared towards also undermining trust, right? That cognitive biases may also play a role in determining who we trust. And expertise may not be dead, but it seems as though some expertise is kind of deliberately undermined in ways, you know, or it might be influenced by, you know, who people should trust, right? So, and also one other piece is that, well, I think that in many cases, you know, it's not a lack of science. I do think there are some cases where there is a lack of understanding of philosophy of science, right? Probably because we're philosophers of science. But, you know, this idea of being able to tell what's the difference between like a meta-analysis of scientific researches versus one single study or a preprint research paper rather than one that's been peer-reviewed. So, that all of those things, you know, that the war on science and those three things can't stand alone. But if we think about, you know, is it possible that all those features kind of interact with trust, even if the trust model is you know, more important to use? And then the second question I just want to raise is, you know, whether you think that there is some usefulness or relevancy in this distinction that some epistemologists have made, right, between kind of warranted epistemic trust or warranted epistemic distrust in this case, right, versus unwarranted, right? So it seems like clearly there are some distrust in science or scientists and African-American, indigenous populations is kind of clearly warranted given past injustices. But some distrust in certain public health officials might end up being unwarranted. And so what implications does that have for how we think about the crisis of trust? Is that a useful distinction or not? Might it influence the kinds of solutions that we need to kind of rebuild trust? So I'm gonna end it there, but thanks again to Maya for a fantastic book, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Kristen. That was so informative and rich. I'm really excited to hear about your work on unmasking. I definitely have followed the mask debate closely, just because it seemed like a sort of a natural progression. As I finished up the vaccines and the vaccine book, and we got into COVID, there certainly are some similarities there that I think I think you were right to notice that they seem to mirror some aspects of vaccine controversy. There was definitely something more politically charged about the masks than all the previous. This is sort of an anecdote than the previous debates and discussions about vaccines. Those can be vitriolic, but there was something about masks that really set people off. And you're right that it started with this assumption that it should just be seen as a small burden and overall a minimal thing to ask. I enjoyed watching it, so I could see how it got quickly politicized in the United States. It sort of represented like where you stood on lockdowns, whether you thought COVID was real or things like that. Meanwhile, I want to give you the Canadian context. There was, you know, anti-masking sentiments, which, you know, people that are okay with masking will often be flippant about and say, oh, that's just an import of some weird American idea coming to Canada. But no, if you actually listen to what was being said there, it wasn't clearly that. So there was discussions about freedoms and liberty, but it wasn't so focused on the individual, whether wearing a mask was difficult or not. And that might be because Canadians are known to be better rule followers than Americans. But the worry that it was going to creep into other larger points of government overreach was strongly there. And of course, you know, although I am a masker and I'm happy to mask as much as possible, it's not irrelevant to think about how public health crises have been used in the past, and even we see it in the present, not in Canada as far as I can tell, to justify power grabs. We think that seems to be happening in Israel right now. It could be happening in India too. So it's not crazy to be worried about the sort of how far this could go. So I'm actually sympathetic to that concern. Unfortunately, like many things, when you start with a sort of broad concern, it's hard to figure out how to apply it. This might actually get into your question about how sort of information and mistrust tie together. So you start with the seed of mistrust. It's a broad one. It's conspiratorial in many ways. By conspiracy, I don't mean it's false. I just mean that it suggests that there's some, you know, nefarious power, nefarious agents pushing it in certain directions. But of course, we struggle because we don't know where to land with that. Does that mean I shouldn't mask? Not clearly. Does that mean I should be watching my government carefully to make sure they don't overreach? Yes, that's probably the right thing to do. And that is a struggle for questions about your last question, Kristen, about warranted epistemic mistrust, that we don't always know how far that should go. There are cases of warranted epistemic mistrust that seem to result in unwarranted epistemic mistrust. Could COVID is probably examples of that, where people assume that a mask is some kind of plot against individual liberty and the futures that we know. But there's, you know, historic examples too, like Black Americans who remember Tuskegee, or, you know, it comes up often in discussions about trust in healthcare. People will cite the Tuskegee case. It led to, in the 1980s, widespread AIDS denialism within the same community, and assumptions that it's either fake or that it's been manufactured by government to kill Black people, and it really set back AIDS treatment in the United States among the populations that needed it most. And now people are wondering if we need to be learning from those kinds of AIDS crises to think about COVID today, where you know, racialized Americans are more likely to say, I don't want the vaccine. And of course, there's global issues around availability too that we could learn from AIDS too, but that's a separate thing. So you seem to identify there something that's sort of messy and hard to work through. It's once you have that creeping concern, that broad-based concern, what do you actually do with it in the individual choices that you make? And of course, we don't always have all of the information. I'm watching the COVID vaccine rollout very closely, and I'm surprised how hard it is to get the information that people want. I'm watching hesitancy among healthcare workers right now, where people say, what, healthcare workers don't want a vaccine? Aren't they scientifically literate? They literally cannot find information that they want to know, like around pregnancy and fertility, things that, you know, fertile women working in healthcare might want to know. They can't find that information. So what that says is we definitely need information. So you were right to push and say, hey, isn't scientific information still important here? But we also need, that information needs to be perceived as trustworthy. So it is not scientifically illiterate people that are saying, I don't want vaccine information through press release. I want independently vetted information about this new vaccine, that kind of thing. So we need the information to fit within a trust framework. It is not independent of a trust framework. And certainly you were right to say that manufactured active efforts to disinform the public will actually engender mistrust. I've been pushed on that a few times when I've given talks, Kristen, that they say, what about manufactured doubt? What about the fight against doubt, you know, the sort of work that you do. And I'm willing to admit, if there was anything like a war of science, it would fit there. But I entered this project starting in the communications setting, where I saw so much activity and priority given to fact-based vaccine information. Debunking myths is like a very popular pastime among bloggers and people that call themselves science communicators. And it's okay to do that. People would like to know that this autism thing isn't something they should be concerned about. But the priority given to fact-based information and debunking the myths, the priority given is not to scale. It's not recognizing that there are other issues that go into people's vaccine hesitancy beyond information or lack of information. So you'll never see me trying to shut down the scientific bloggers and the debunkers. However, I will challenge them on why they think they somehow capture the entire landscape of dealing with contentious health decisions.
Okay, thank you so much, Kristen, Maya. So, Sven?
Well, it's a real pleasure to be commenting, first of all, reading and then commenting on your book. Great book. And like Kirsten, I'm in broad agreement. I think it's absolutely correct to say that vaccine hesitancy should not be framed as a war on science, but as a crisis of trust. So I agree with the general premise of the book. And so what I want to do in my short comments is I want to say a few things about chapters 4, 5, and 6. And I understand my comments as being friendly amendments, because I think there's certain themes or topics that aren't maybe as pronounced or as developed in the book as they should. Of course, no book can do everything, but those were the themes that I think make the situation in a way much more messy than it is often portrayed to be. And of course, you yourself agree with this. The situation is messy. It's one of values instead of just anti-science. So that's why I said I understand these comments as being friendly amendments. So I want to make 4 points, 4 points about 3 chapters. The first point concerns the chapter on chapter 4, politicized science and scientized politics. So I think this is a wonderful chapter because it discusses the complex interaction between science and politics. And of course, whenever there's a program that is government mandated, a health program, these two come together, science and politics. And the issue of vaccine hesitancy is about what science, which science to trust. And it's not only about science, but also about political issues. So you criticize, following Pielke, what is called the linear model of science to policy, that we can read off the correct political decisions from the science. And that model is dangerously simplistic. And first of all, it mischaracterizes the science as giving clear directives for political processes, and it abuses also science to rationalize decision-making processes that are really politically motivated. So I'm in full agreement. I think this chapter should be more or less made into a bumper sticker. So that's all great. And so once we leave the linear model behind, we see that policy decision-making does not require the convergence of science and policy action. So the real disputes are about values. What I wanted to add, and you do mention this in the chapter, but to me, this wasn't highlighted, maybe to the degree that I would have liked to see it, is that unlike other political controversial issues, like like gun ownership or global warming or marijuana legalization or nuclear power, prostitution legalization, high school sex education. The issue of childhood vaccination is not dependent on party politics lines. And maybe I could present. I have a PowerPoint presentation, but I don't know whether. This is work from Kahan out of Yale, showing party politics and these issues, and you more or less see a strong correlation between party political affiliations, conservative versus liberal, and these controversial issues. And the funny thing, at least about childhood vaccination, so we're not talking about vaccination in general, is that it doesn't seem to depend on which camp one is in, whether or not the risk perception of vaccines does not directly align to party policy. This is, I think, a very interesting observation. I don't know whether this data is trustworthy. It can be relied upon, but if it can, this is important because what it shows is that demonizing vaccine hesitators or vaccine skepticism in general and playing the we against us game is doomed to backfire because it's doomed to target people in one's own political group. So it is a very delicate topic in that sense. These other topics can be used for creating group identities. Childhood vaccination issues don't seem to work in that way. It splits up the traditional groups, party politic groups. So it is an interesting topic in that respect, but also a dangerous topic if it is politicized. Okay, that was my addition to chapter 4. Now I come to chapter 5, which talks about trust and credibility in science. Maya argues that vaccine hesitancy rests on distrust in the medical system, in science, and in government recommendations. And she talks about what trust is. And once again, I think in general, I agree at least, that the crucial role that trust plays and the lack thereof for issues of vaccine hesitancy. What I would like to add is the discussion of the sources of the mistrust that are identified in the book. So there are 3 reasons mentioned for why members of the public may not trust the scientific consensus on vaccines. That's social media, that's medical racism, and that's the commercialization of biomedical science. I think there's one other aspect that is important, and that has to do with statistical versus individualized evidence. So I have one more slide that I would like to show. This is just a slide of the hierarchy of evidence in evidence-based medicine. And what we see is at the top of the pyramid, that is the kind of evidence that is most trusted, are meta-analyses of large RCTs. So the point I want to make is the evidence that is used is purely of a statistical kind. And expert opinion or observational studies and so on, they rank much lower on the evidence scale. So stop sharing now. This, I think, is important to bear in mind, that the directives and the recommendations, they are all based on statistical evidence over large portions of the population, many countries often. And people are in general really, really bad in understanding statistical information and in translating statistical information into directives for personal action. And those who see vaccine mandates as an infringement of their rights, or as the government telling individuals what to do in cases where it's not necessary, they may see a vaccine as sort of like a sentence almost. And the reason I use the term sentence here is because there's this stark contrast between the role that statistical evidence plays in the legal realm, in criminal justice, with the role it plays in evidence-based medicine. So many people have the intuition that something is fundamentally different between statistical evidence and non-statistical evidence in the legal realm. And the intuitive difference between the two types of evidence is demonstrated by empirical research, according to which people tend to disregard the background statistical evidence when non-statistical evidence is available. So, perceptual evidence is usually always trumps statistical evidence. And you could never get a conviction on the basis of statistical evidence alone in the legal realm. So even if the likelihood of someone having committed the murder or having done something is really high, if there's no evidence tying it to this particular individual, then it wouldn't be good enough to get a conviction. So in the evidence-based medicine, however, it's different. So here, statistical evidence trumps non-statistical evidence. People who are worried about vaccine safety and effectiveness might be worried about, rare kinds of side effects being washed out of the large RCTs and meta-studies used to establish vaccine safety and effectiveness. So I want to mention this because I think it's not just a war on science, it's a trust in science. It may even be a trust in the scientific method. But the question is, what does the scientific method tell me about my particular individual case? And this is a really, really messy issue. And of course, in the case of childhood vaccination, parents, maybe rightly so, claim that they know the best what the particular needs or sensitivities of the children are. And so they're asked to take statistical evidence and have that supersede whatever individualized evidence they have. So this issue of statistical versus individualized evidence, I think, is a very important one for this issue, for the issue of understanding vaccine hesitancy. Okay, where am I? I now want to talk about chapter 6. Chapter 6 is about the scientific expert as a hero and maverick. So that chapter deals with medical expertise, what it is, and how a layperson can distinguish medical experts from charlatans. And following the work of Elizabeth Anderson, Maya recommends some criteria for assessing the trustworthiness of scientific experts. First of all, an evaluation of the speaker's scientific expertise, the assessment of the speaker's moral character, and an evaluation of the speaker's epistemic character. So I think all of this is good. I have no objection to these three-part criteria. But once again, in the spirit of providing friendly amendments, I think there's the issues are in a way more complicated for two reasons. First of all, the first reason is that a layperson usually does not really interact with a scientist proposing a certain thesis. So as a layperson, we are not in touch with the scientists, but rather we learn about the medical recommendation or the scientific recommendations through other channels such as politicians or medical practitioners who are, of course, not scientists. And this makes it more difficult to detect the trustworthiness of the science behind it or the scientists behind it. The layperson finds themselves at the end of a long communication chain. They may wonder whether anything got lost or was omitted or was altered along the way of this communication chain. So there's a little bit of an analogy here with social media. In social media, which of course social media plays a large role for the whole issue of the safety of vaccines, we knew about assertions and their normative role all along. But since social media came along, we now have a new quasi-assertion a new quasi-assertion has emerged, and that's the retweeting. Retweeting is really interesting because there is the trustworthiness of the original source, but then there's also the authority of the person who retweets it. And that can either lend support to the original message that is passed along, or it can water it down. And so in retweeting, sometimes we are not responding to the original message as much as we are responding to the person who delivers it to us. And so when medical information or scientific information about vaccines is passed along a chain of communication where the last person in the chain may be just a nurse or a politician who has zero scientific background, you may wonder to what extent you're still getting the full message. So these issues of communication chains, I felt that's an interesting issue. Of course, it is much broader than just vaccine skepticism, but it bubbles up in the issue of vaccine skepticism as well. This brings me to my last point, again, about chapter 6. So when a subject matter is scientific or technical, it's, of course, often beneficial to form a belief on authority. But when you form a belief on authority, the question is what happens to the other reasons you have for or against the belief? So how is trust in experts to be weighed against beliefs one has, one already holds? And so this, of course, is an issue that Kristen mentioned as well. And there are several views here one can take. A view that is, social epistemology, quite prominent at the moment, at least, is the so-called preemption view, which says that the authoritative reasons becomes or should become the only reason for which you ought to support the belief in whatever it is. So you basically should forget about your own reasoning on that subject. But that view, preemption view it's called, has of course come under fire from different quarters. Some argue that believing on the basis of authoritative reasons plus other reasons may, that one has, can be done responsibly and rationally, and can be just as truth conducive as preempting. And others say that maximizing true beliefs is really not the only goal. Really what we should try to aim for is make people understand and appreciate the evidence and basically go through the reasoning process themselves. But if that was the case, then one would have to somehow teach the skills and abilities and know how to partake in the epistemic practice for the inquiry. And of course, when it's an issue of life and death, often that takes second place, and the instilling of true beliefs is considered to be more pertinent, more important. In general, the question is, what do we do with our Enlightenment ideals? Or how do we protect against or do not invite gullibility when at the same time trying to teach or bring scientific message to the population? So again, these are big issues, but I felt that for building trust, and I think that's the title of the last chapter, this issue of how trust can be built with and of course, there's probably not a single answer to this question, how trust can be built. It has to be built bottom up just as well as top down. But this issue of what should we do with what we already believe or feel that we know about a particular subject matter, how could that be integrated, is vital, because yeah, that's where the messages that's coming from the health officials on the one hand need to be rationalized in people's heads. Anyways, that's all I have to say. And once again, thank you very much for writing this stimulating book.
Thank you so much for your comments, Sven. There's a lot to say because you brought up many good issues. I'll start with that graphic that you'd shown of Dan Kahan's work on sort of politicized attitudes towards scientifically controversial issues. So I know Kahan's work quite well. You asked, is this a good source? I'll say yes. Dan Kahan on cultural cognition does excellent work. That graphic was part of a paper that was published in 2014. And I remember that was something that was known about vaccine hesitancy, is that it didn't divide on political lines the way he's looking at the US context, but the way something like climate change is, where in the US it divides almost perfectly. Republicans think climate change statements are overstated. Democrats think they're done accurately, if not understated. And of course, that's always an interesting thing to think about. I teach undergrad students about this, to think about how it's not a matter of scientific literacy, but it's got a lot to do with other ideological commitments and backgrounds that actually end up informing how you assess scientific information. So that's Kahan's work on cultural cognition. At the time, it was the case that vaccines were seen as, did not divide that way because there were all kinds of heuristics that made vaccine refusal both a right-wing issue and a left-wing issue. So there's a sort of libertarian streak on the right that will say you cannot vaccinate me or my children, it's my choice, personal liberty first. On the left, there's sort of a natural living kind of natural lifestyle that makes vaccination seem outside of that worldview. At the same time, vaccine acceptance fits on the right with people that believe in sort of hierarchy, social hierarchies, and think you should listen to doctors the same way, you know, men are above women and doctors are above non-doctors and that kind of thing. And on the left, people with communitarian values will see vaccination as a good exercise of community and striving for the public good. And I remember this paper was sort of pretty new when I first started my research, and I saw some comment on, I don't remember if Kahan said it himself or someone commenting on this sort of body of research saying, whatever we do, for goodness sake, don't let vaccines get politicized the way climate change does, because otherwise we're doomed. And of course, that's unfortunately in the years since then, vaccines have become more polarizing than that. There is still a left-wing contingent that hesitates and is against vaccines, but because of the sort of Trump and populist phenomena, anti-vaccine sentiment got shifted to the right. And we see that, you know, in the States, all the surveys show that you know, more people that vote Democrat and like Biden were more likely to get the COVID vaccine. People that are Trump supporters, less likely. I believe we're seeing the same political polarization in Brazil with Bolsonaro anti-vaccine. If you're a Doria supporter, is pro-vaccine. So vaccines have become more politicized in that way that everyone hoped it wouldn't. Now, the solution to that would be the thing about appealing to separate values that Kristen mentioned and that I discussed in the book, how you can sometimes bring people over to see things in new light if you can make it, if you can frame it in the values that are important to those people. So things like associating masks with opening up the economy is a good way to bring people over on masks. Similarly, you could probably do the same with vaccines with some of the examples that I'd given about making it conducive to the natural living worldview, as I discussed in chapter 2, but you could also do other versions of that to appeal to the more right-wing vaccine hesitators. Okay, so that is the politicized context of vaccines, and I'm glad you brought it up because I'm happy to speak about it. The second, the point that you addressed in chapter 5 about evidence-based medicine, I could talk about evidence-based medicine all day. I actually wrote my dissertation on philosophical issues around evidence-based medicine because there's so much to work on there. You specifically targeted the difference of thinking about statistical evidence versus individual notions of risk or evidence. And I actually did try to address that in, it was the first chapter on public misunderstanding of science, where I was trying to say, I don't think this is a problem of misunderstanding when parents say they are really, really concerned about adverse events. They even will, the testimonies and the surveys will show, sorry, interviews, not surveys, will get statements from parents saying, what if my kid will be the one who has an adverse event? So by saying that, they are understanding the state of the science, that vaccines are mostly safe, that some kids will get seriously harmed, and they do they do the risk analysis differently. They don't accept that their kid should be possibly that one, but probably not. They say, it is my responsibility as a parent to protect my child from all things, and that includes the rare and unlikely event of a serious reaction to the vaccine. So they are insisting on doing that individualized risk assessment, and it is puzzling to me that those kind of statements get framed as anti-science or somehow misunderstanding. Instead, what they're doing is understanding the science perfectly, but saying, I don't accept the sort of population level evidence that you can give me until you can tell me whether my kid is going to get it, or at least more likely to get it. I'm not trusting of, I'm not satisfied by the information that's there. And there is research, I should add as an aside, there is research into adverse events. It's called adversomics. I feel like that body of research, which does not get the funding it needs, should be front and center in vaccine communications to send the message that public health does care about individual kids. They would like adverse events to be zero. And in fact, they are trying very hard to do that kind of work, like predicting our kids with, you know, a history of febrile seizures more likely to have an adverse event. Those kind of sort of parent-driven theories that have been around for probably 2 decades deserve the attention that the broad population level health research gets. So I agree with you that the statistical versus individual risk assessment is an issue there. And it speaks to scientists. Of course, we need the statistical evidence, but we also need to be thinking about what people want to know. So, you know, there's many ways that we've called for more public involvement in scientific research. One way is to do that is to actually get people at the table to tell us, what is it you want to know about vaccines? And then we'd have a much different way of parsing through the research. There are just, I just pointed, and you noticed it too, there is a serious gap in the research and a very easily identified gap that's been around for a long time. And addressing it would do a lot to help the current, you know, divisions over vaccines. Moving to your comments about chapter 6, Sven, I have not thought about communications chains and social media. I admit I haven't done much research into social media and echo chambers. I guess I'll admit that I had to tack that in because every talk that I gave about vaccines would have someone saying, but what about social media, right? We want to blame social media for the problem that we're in. And I suspect that social media amplifies the problem that we're in, might even make it worse, but I don't think it's not like if social media disappeared, we wouldn't have vaccine hesitancy. In fact, we had vaccine hesitancy long before social media. Instead, what we get is this amplification. And I'll agree, I liked your language of communication chains, that it complicates it, makes it harder to resolve. It certainly has impact on people's attitudes and behavior. But when I looked at when I tried to think about that question, isn't it the source, which at least I don't think it's a very well thought out view, but it's a sort of common response people make. I don't think it's the source, but it'd be worth looking more into. I think there has been research into it, more into like, how does this information get amplified and moved in and out? There's been interesting sort of network theory and modeling of how misinformation gets pinged around the internet and who gets exposed to it. And then there's also been good psychology research on how people interact with information and are impacted by it, because not everyone goes on the internet and believes everything, but what is it about the repetition and the you know, perceived credibility of it that actually makes people eventually adopt it, even if only passively. There's a lot of good work to be done there that I admit I haven't been a part of. So thank you for identifying it. I think you had one last point about how our trust in experts, how we integrate that into our prior beliefs about anything, whether vaccines or not. Well, 2 things seem to be happening, at least in the psychology research that I'm familiar with. Is one is people are more likely to trust experts that say the things that they already know to be true. And of course, that's a common cognitive bias and not even a bad one, that we are more skeptical of things that don't fit with our prior beliefs. At the same time, we might come around if there's something about that expert that seems compelling. So there's research that I cited in the book about one way, so one way to bring people along is to have a diversity of experts that present a message. So, you know, getting people to go into, let's say people of color, to go into their communities and talk about vaccines is a way to bring people along, because suddenly they're hearing it from someone who they find more trustworthy, just because they're part of my community, they understand my values and they know where I'm coming from. And if it is that you're part of a marginalized community that thinks that there might be active harm being committed against your community, you say, you're a person that wouldn't want to harm me. So you try to integrate those aspects. You bring in and someone who is otherwise trustworthy, saying things, something that might seem odd to you, and you might be a little less defensive and more open to it. I live in Toronto, and there's been a lot of outreach happening actually right now with healthcare workers from BIPOC communities going into their communities, offering webinars in a variety of languages. And, you know, we'll see later what kind of numbers they get, but they're at least saying these are people that normally wouldn't talk to healthcare workers and don't trust experts. But when an expert looks like them, an expert is more likely to be trusted. So I think that's the integration of expert sources and prior held beliefs. I think that's probably the best method we have right now.
Okay, thank you so much, Sven, Maya, for your reply. Well, since we are almost without time, I would like to thank everyone for participating. And of course, a special thanks to Maya for giving us this opportunity to discuss her book. It was a great session, lots of inspiring thoughts for sure. And once again, I would like to thank, if you like to buy Maya's book, you can check the information here at the description below. And if you like to stay up to date with our future installments of Philosopher Meets Critics or other events organized by Concept, you can visit us at concept-phil.de, or you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, Figments of the Brain. With that said, once again, thank you everyone for participation, and thanks for watching.